It's almost a stereotype to say that the God of the Old Testament is an angry God, a God who lashes out at people vindictively. So how should we think about God's anger in the Old Testament? Now, of course, that's a huge question, and I can't adequately answer it in a short video, but let's make a few steps toward an answer. I'm going to take 3 Old Testament passages that speak about God's anger, passages that have helped me understand this topic better. Based on these 3 passages, I want to make 3 primary points about God's anger in the Old Testament. The episode of the golden calf in Exodus 32 is the first time in the Bible that God is ever said to be angry. Even in the flood story, when human violence filled the earth, God is said to be grieved in his heart. He was saddened, not angered. But even there, God is affected by what humans do. But then God enters into a covenant with Israel, and he's angry when the covenant is broken, when they commit idolatry. That's just like a marriage covenant. If one partner is unfaithful, the other partner would be justifiably angry. So anger here is a function of the intensity of the relationship. It means that God cares, and so is deeply affected. So in Exodus chapter 32, verse 10, God tells Moses to leave him alone so that his anger might burn hot against the people so he can destroy them and start over again with Moses. Notice that God does not say that he is actually angry enough to destroy the people right then and there. Instead, he asks Moses to give him time to get angry, enough to destroy them. 2 chapters later, in Exodus 34, it's revealed that God is actually slow to anger. He doesn't have a short fuse, if you will. So why would God tell Moses, leave him alone? If God really wanted to destroy the people, he could just wait till he was good and steamed and then just do it. But it's clear he actually doesn't want to destroy them. He wants someone to moderate his anger while there's time. It's like someone in a bar fight saying, hold me back, hold me back. God invites Moses to, as later texts will say, step into the breach like a defense attorney and intercede on behalf of Israel. So in a long prayer, Moses implores God not to destroy the people. That's Exodus 32, verses 11 to 13. Then comes verse 14, when God immediately agrees. Just like that. And this becomes a pattern in the Exodus story and the wilderness wanderings. Israel sins, God gets angry. Moses intercedes, God forgives them. Over and over, that's the pattern. The point is that God is relational. This is not a cosmic abstraction up in the sky, but the Creator, who really cares about his creations. What we do affects God. Our actions, for good or ill, impact God. We can really grieve God or make God angry. Now, I don't want to claim that God is just like a human being in being saddened or angered. God cannot be reduced to that. But the biblical writers thought that God was similar enough to us. After all, we're made in God's image and likeness. That God can be described with human emotions. But note that when God gets angry, because he cares, right? He actually wants to moderate that anger. And when the whole golden calf story is over, God reveals something very important to Moses, which explains why he went and told Moses, somewhat ironically, leave me alone that my anger may burn hot. In the famous passage in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, we're told that God is a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, showing love to thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. So yes, God gets angry, but underlying that anger is God's desire to forgive and to show love. So now we come to our second passage and the point that just because God initiates something doesn't mean that it turns out as God desires. So the book of Zechariah is a collection of prophecies from the 6th century exile after Jerusalem has been destroyed by the Babylonian armies. And in the first chapter, verse 12, the question is raised, O Lord of hosts, how long will you withhold mercy from Jerusalem and the cities of Judah with which you've been angry these 70 years. 70 years is the length of the exile, the time during which the land of Israel lay waste with its cities destroyed. And God explains that he isn't actually angry anymore with the people, and he's certainly not angry enough to justify 70 years of devastation. He's actually angry with the Babylonians and the other nations that with Babylon attacked and destroyed Jerusalem. And the reason is given in verse 15. I was only a little angry, but they made the disaster worse. Here we should note that there are many prophetic books in the Bible, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and others, that claim that God uses foreign leaders and armies and empires as his instruments to accomplish judgment for his people or deliverance of his people. But lest we think that God just gets angry and then lashes out with these foreign powers as unwitting instruments. The passage in Zechariah says he was only a little angry with his own people. But the vicious and destructive attack of the Babylonian army on Israel went beyond the bounds of what he intended. In other words, Zechariah is suggesting that God only nudged the Babylonians to move against Jerusalem. But what they did was excessively violent beyond what God's anger justified. Just as with God inviting Moses to intercede for Israel and so moderate his anger, here God is fundamentally relational. God is not a puppet master pulling strings. Yes, God uses human actors to accomplish his will, but they have genuine freedom in how they respond. And just because God initiates something doesn't mean it turns out exactly as he desires. Now, the third passage from the book of Job teaches us that God does not want to act out of anger. So Job is the classic righteous man, perfect in every way, who suffers terrible calamities. And Job's three friends, in quotes, friends, have been trying to convince him in a series of lengthy dialogues that make up most of the book that he must have sinned greatly to deserve such horrendous suffering. But we know from the book that he wasn't a great sinner, he was a righteous man. And Job objects that he hasn't done anything to deserve his suffering, but that God is causing him pain unjustly, because God's in control, of course. And the friends try and defend God. They say, whatever God does, he can do. You can never question his ways. And they tell Job that humans are actually like moths or worms to God. He couldn't care less about them. So Job, even if you think you didn't sin, just submit to God's will and accept his suffering. Job keeps on protesting that he's innocent. He doesn't deserve his suffering, and he finally demands an accounting from God. In fact, he challenges God directly in prayer. But the gist of the story is that God answers Job in a personal theophany, a dazzling appearance out of a wind or a storm. And when God is finished speaking, without ever explaining why Job suffered, Job is comforted. Notice the translations that say that Job repents are simply wrong. No biblical scholar ever believes that. It's actually the word to comfort. He's somehow comforted by God's appearance. After this, God speaks to Eliphaz, one of Job's three friends, and God tells him, my anger is kindled against you and your two friends, because you've not spoken of me what's right, as my servant Job has. Interesting. 2 points here. First, why is God angry at Eliphaz and his friends? Because they have not been speaking rightly of God. They've been representing God as a vindictive deity who doesn't care about his creatures. But in God's speeches, he's shown Job all the wild animals that he cares for, even though no human being cares for them. God is a God who cares for his creatures. And the second point is that God doesn't want to act on his anger towards the friends. So he tells them, my servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to folly. Interesting. God doesn't want to act according to folly. Many translations say according to your folly, but there's no your in the original. That is supplied as an interpretation. God is actually saying, I don't just want to lash out in anger. That would be folly. I want to moderate my anger. So to moderate his anger, he's going to have Job pray for the friends, much as Moses prayed for Israel at the golden calf. And God says he will accept Job's prayer. So once again, we have a passage on anger that shows a relational God who cares about what people do. In fact, what we do affects God deeply, even to the point of anger. So yes, God gets angry, but God doesn't want to act out of the anger. So the God of the Bible invites us into a relationship with him, a real relationship which requires engagement. And this relationship impacts both us and God. I think that Moses and Job in the first and the last text that I talked about illustrate the nature of this relational God very well. Moses and Job, like many others in the Bible, are utterly honest with God, even challenging God, telling him what they think about it and what he should do. And the amazing thing is that God is open to this sort of vigorous challenge. It turns out that the Bible assumes that it's by our strenuous engagement with God that we, like Moses and Job, are able to come to understand that most fundamentally, God's anger, which is real, is an expression of a deep and abiding love. God's commitment to a genuine relationship where each partner matters. So yes, the anger of God in the Old Testament is actually a wonderful tool to teach about the nature of our loving God.